Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us on today's Within the Framework webinar, hosted by National Center for Pyramid Model Innovation. So I'm Lisa Fox, and I'm the director of NCPMI, and I'm the host of the Within the Framework series. So today's topic is understanding challenging behavior, the path to behavior support. And our presenters are Dr. Glenn Dunlap and Janice Lee. Glenn's one of the developers of positive behavior support and the pyramid model. He's my mentor and a really treasured colleague. He's contributed more to what we know about the design and implementation of individualized interventions for young children than anyone else in our field. So we're really lucky to have him here. Joining him is Dr. Janice Lee, who's a really important contributor to providing guidance for how to do individualized interventions in early childhood. Janice has been a partner with Glenn in the development of Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, and we also call that PTRYC, and Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Families. These are two really wonderful practical resources that help guide the design and implementation of behavior plans. If you don't know about it, you might want to find those resources. So Glenn and Janice, we are super excited about today's webinar. Take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Lisa. Good afternoon to everybody. Lisa, that introduction has made me blush, so I will attempt to struggle through this. By the way, I am Glenn Dunlap, and my colleague Janice Lee will be joining us very shortly. In this webinar, we're going to go back and forth a few times, and we'll try to share what we know. Yeah, there we are. Today's agenda is basically three parts. We're going to start off by defining what the heck challenging behaviors are and what they mean. And then we'll spend some time trying to pull apart what we mean by understanding challenging behavior. What is this thing that we're talking about understanding what this challenging behavior is and why? And to a large extent, the why we are trying to understand challenging behavior is the last section in our agenda, which is important, critical implications for prevention and intervention. So with that, let's just jump right into defining challenging behavior. This is the definition that we use in this field, and we think it's valid, and a lot of people have embraced it, so we're going with it. The definition essentially is any repeated pattern of behavior that interferes with learning or engagement in pro-social interactions with peers and adults. Okay, these are behaviors that are not responsive to the use of developmentally appropriate guidance procedures. Now, there are many, many examples. Some are listed at the bottom of the slide: prolonged tantrums, aggression, highly disruptive vocal and motor behavior, self-injury, property destruction, repeated non-compliance, and even some what we refer to as internalizing behaviors such as withdrawal. As you can understand, if you have repeated patterns of withdrawal, they can seriously interfere with learning or engagement in pro-social interactions. So those two can be considered challenging behavior. I want to emphasize a few things here. Challenging behavior is defined on the basis of its effects. In other words, it's not just what you see in here, it's the impact that it has. And also, not all disruptive behavior is considered to be challenging. After all young children, and most of us older children, engage in challenging behavior or disruptive behavior from time to time. But our definition insists that challenging behavior needs to be repeated, it's a real pattern, and that it be unresponsive to typical developmentally appropriate guidance. So with that, there's a couple of examples here. Jordan, who is a very fine young girl, will scream, yell, scratch, hit, sometimes throw toys that are within reach. That's an example of challenging behavior because it's repeated, it's been going on for some time, and it's unresponsive. People have tried to guide her to other kinds of behavioral patterns, but she has been unresponsive. So that's a challenging behavior. And then Hector is another example. He will climb on furniture, run away, hide, doesn't respond to directions, can be disruptive, and even may laugh and smile irritatingly while this is happening. Um, it's referred to by his teachers as disruptive, but because it's repeated, because it's unresponsive, we consider this also to be challenging behavior. Now, before we go any further, and while we have these examples up here, I'd like to give a little bit of further consideration to the title of this webinar, that is Understanding Challenging Behavior. What does understanding challenging behavior mean? Well, I can tell you that 45 years ago, which is roughly when I began my professional endeavors with people with this difficult behaviors, understanding challenging behavior didn't mean very much. Back then, our understanding was simply that challenging behaviors were maintained by some kind of reinforcement, mainly inadvertent positive reinforcers like attention, or removal of negative reinforcers like unpleasant demands. And that was pretty much it. Yeah, that was pretty much it. The implications for intervention were only that one should identify the reinforcers that were maintaining the challenging behavior and withhold them, and provide reinforcers for desirable behavior rather than challenging behavior. In other words, intervention based on that level of understanding simply boiled down to something called contingency management, manipulating the consequences. Well, that understanding and that advice actually is still valid, but it is also very limited. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a handful of behavioral scientists began to realize that there was more to it. And importantly, the more to it had huge implications for our ability to prevent challenging behaviors and to intervene much more effectively, efficiently, and respectfully. The more to it has to do with function, and in particular, communicative function. And understanding these principles has led us to a new generation of understanding and a new approach to positive behavior support. When we now talk about understanding challenging behavior, we are talking not only about the reinforcers that maintain the behavior, we are now talking about all of the environmental circumstances that influence behavior. And these include consequences, but also the antecedent events that are associated with challenging behavior. And especially, we're talking about the functions of the challenging behavior. And we now recognize that challenging behavior is essentially a social behavior. Challenging behavior occurs in a social context, and that challenging behavior now can be interpreted in almost all cases as, yes, communication. Now, this kind of understanding, which first started to emerge about 40 years ago, constitutes something of a paradigm shift in how we interpret and deal with challenging behavior. And Janice will now have more to say on this topic. And so I want to hand the slides off to Janice. Your turn.
Great. Thank you, Glenn, and welcome to everyone from across the US. We're seeing lots of states represented and also our international participants in audience today. So that's pretty exciting to have some check-ins from around the world. So thank you. And just a quick reminder, if you have any questions as we're going along, please put them in the Q&A function within Zoom, and then we will answer those at the end. So yes, let me jump in. Thank you, Glenn, for that context. I think it's vitally important, and I already saw a couple of comments showing appreciation for that. So as we understand or want to understand challenging behavior in this paradigm shift, we generally refer to two components of challenging behavior, which I'm going to touch on briefly, and that is form and function. So we'll do next slide. So when we talk about forms of challenging behavior, it's essentially what it looks like. So when Glenn shared some examples just a few minutes ago, that is the form of the challenging behavior. So, tantrums, biting, all of these examples that we have on the screen here, including those internalizing behaviors that were already mentioned that we would classify as withdrawal. As a potential option. And so again, just very briefly, when we talk about the form of challenging behavior, it's essentially what it looks like. And then as we shift to the function of the challenging behavior, next slide, Glenn. We want to also discuss this in terms of the communicative function, again, that we talked about. And so this is a very general and basic way to classify the function or purpose of challenging behavior. And these are two very broad categories. And again, this is just a broad generalization, is either the child is communicating that they need or want something, that they want, something that they want to obtain, or they may be communicating that they want to avoid or get away from something. And so again, there are other nuances to this, but these are just very general ways as we're beginning to shift our perspectives and really think about understanding challenging behavior in terms of its communicative function for very young children. These are, again, very broad categories. So delve into this topic a little bit deeper, just a little bit. Next slide, please. All right, so as was already mentioned, but it's worth repeating and worth ensuring that we all fully are committed to this component or this understanding, is that most challenging behaviors serve the same purpose as other forms or types of communication. So we think about speech or the words that children use, but also thinking about nonverbal gestures, facial expressions, and other types of body language we could incorporate in here. And oftentimes in the context or the circumstances that we're talking about, challenging behaviors may serve the same function as requests or demands. And so whereas we would encourage and be teaching young children to, use their words or verbal language, or even non-verbally through signs or gestures or other types of nonverbal communication systems, challenging behavior often is what children resort to when they don't have more appropriate skills to express themselves in a more socially and culturally appropriate way. Next. And the reason why those challenging behaviors continue to occur is because they act and react from the social environment similarly to those other forms of communication that we would deem, most of us would deem as socially appropriate. But in that way, although challenging behavior is communicative, it's not necessarily deliberate or conscious or on purpose in that sense, especially when we're talking about young children. And related to that is the form, or what it looks like, right? The type of challenging behavior does not necessarily relate to the communicative attempt or intent of that challenging behavior. So what do we mean by that? Well, ultimately, that challenging behavior may be the same in different situations, like crying, for example, or big tantrums, but the purpose or the communicative purpose might differ. So sometimes, for example, children might tantrum because we're playing inside or outside, and it's now time to go inside, and they don't want to do that. And so their tantrum or their screaming or crying may be communicating essentially, I'm not ready, or I don't want to go inside, I'm having too much fun out here. And then in a different situation, that same type of tantrum could be used to let somebody else know that they're playing with their favorite toy and that they want to have that and they don't agree with that. So that's where we start to see some differentiation, and we want to make sure that these understandings are clear as we talk about this topic, because it does impact our perceptions of challenging behavior, as well as how we might intervene or respond to those. And so similar to what Glenn talked about in terms of the interpretation of what is challenging behavior, is that not everyone agrees. And so in other aspects, you might refer to pet peeves or hot buttons. And so thinking about all those in context, and these are all contributing factors to why we talk about the social environment, and that within those interactions between individuals, how that all relates to each other and how that might differ from situation to situation. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so here's another way to look at it as well, right? Just to continue a little bit further. These are just examples of some things, common things that young children would want to get or be able to attain. So we think about attention in terms of social interactions or requesting help or seeking help, for example, or assistance with something, right? Getting to something, opening a package, right, for a food or a snack. All of those kinds of things are lumped under this general category of attention or attention seeking. It might be something tangible, so a toy or an object, or even access to a particular activity. So those could be things like screen time or painting, all of those kinds of things, right? Young children may be interested in communicating that they want something. And then there might be a sensory need as well. So if we think about our five senses, right, it could be a need or a request for movement, right? Lots of activity, large motor types of activity, also thinking about like hugs or other types of physical affection, or even, thinking about music or sounds, so thinking about a child's favorite song or just music in general. And so when we think about this category of function, these are essentially subcategories of that. And so as you can see, there are many, many examples that we could include here. So this is just a brief overview of the typical types of things that the young children that we are talking about and addressing with our webinar today are common experiences that you probably are very familiar with and it can resonate with. All right, next slide, please. And then the other primary, broad category of the function or purpose of challenging behavior is to avoid or escape this, right? To get rid of something in their environment. So just like similar to the same categories exist here. So sometimes as young children, we might want to avoid or escape certain types of attention. So it might be a particular person, for example, that could be an adult or a peer, but it could also be that type of attention or interaction related to directions or instructions that are given by others in their environment, whether it's an adult or another peer. And so when we think about our own experiences, there are times when we want to avoid or get away from or escape certain types of attention. And so with young children also, we think about those tangible things that you can see or touch or hold. For some children, certain activities might be something they want to avoid or escape. So common examples are things like cleaning up or certain activities within a classroom or certain directions like it's time to wash your hands or go to the bathroom. So thinking about many of those transition types of activities that young children are asked or required to engage in that they may or may not enjoy or want to actively avoid. And then also particular foods or snacks, for example. So, is that something that they have a choice in? And so sometimes that might be an option. And then very similarly too, in terms of sensory needs that they were trying to avoid or escape. Think about many young children where, even for ourselves, if it's too loud or chaotic, that might be a time that might be a function or a purpose for their challenging behavior, trying to get away or escape or avoid that. They could also be trying to avoid or escape physical affection or types of touch, certain textures or fabrics. And again, hopefully this will stimulate some of your own thoughts with children that you're thinking about in this process. So again, these are two very broad categories around the communicative function or purpose of challenging behavior is what are they trying to get or access, or what are they trying to get rid of or avoid. All right, next slide. So again, very broad understandings of this. So, and I will turn it back to Glenn.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you very much. So if you have repeated patterns of these kinds of challenging behaviors, and they've been going on for a while, somehow these challenging behaviors are working for the child. They're working to get something or to avoid or escape from something, but they're working. And it may seem crazy to us as we observe, what do you mean? How can that be? But somehow, some way, they must be working or they wouldn't continue. So now that we have an idea about, what these functions, might be, how do we go about figuring this out? How do we go about acquiring this understanding that we need for a particular child exhibiting a particular challenging behavior? We want to determine the function or the reason why there's challenging behaviors, but how do we do that? Well, the answer is functional behavioral assessment. And, this is a term that I know that people have heard, and undoubtedly many, maybe most of you have actually conducted some kind of functional behavioral assessment in order to get some traction on trying to understand what this challenging behavior is all about. So I want to emphasize a couple of things about functional behavioral assessment. One is it's a process. Functional behavioral assessment is a process. It's a process undertaken in order to gain a good understanding of the relationship between a challenging behavior and events in the social environment. And the point of all this is that this understanding will help us resolve the child's challenging behavior in an effective and respectful manner and help guide the child to a more healthy and adaptive trajectory of social emotional development. This functional behavioral assessment thing is a process. And it has some objectives. A good functional behavioral assessment, when it's completed, will come up with really good, confident answers to these questions. And the questions are, under what circumstances does this challenging behavior occur? Another way of asking that is like, what are the predictors? What are the environmental circumstances that lead to this? We're interested in the circumstances associated with the challenging behavior, but we're also interested in the circumstances or predictors in the environment that are associated with desirable behavior. And I think you can understand that if we can understand these principles, if we can really pinpoint down what these circumstances and predictors are, that we could exert some control. Like if we provide the circumstances associated with desirable behavior, voila, we might be able to occasion more and more of that desirable behavior. So understanding this is pretty important. Sometimes getting answers to this first set of questions is simple. Like for some children, there might be a particular trigger that leads to very disruptive behavior, crying and tantruming and stomping and so on. And sometimes it's more complicated. For example, sometimes if a teacher asks Jordan to come into a circle time and engage with other children, Jordan will do so happily and she'll participate. Very nice. But you know what? On some days, Jordan hasn't had any sleep and she's on edge, or she might be anxious about something else. And in those circumstances, when you're asked to join the circle, you might get extreme resistance. So sometimes it's more complicated, but it's important to figure all that out. All right, a second objective is what follows challenging behavior? What are the consequences? Well, this is something that people have been wanting to know for decades and decades. That is, what are the potential rewards or reinforcers for engaging in this challenging behavior? The easiest way to determine that is to look at what follows the challenging behavior. What is the consequence? What's the response to the challenging behavior? If it's a lot of blubbering attention, well, maybe that kind of attention is what the reward is. If it's to be picked up and removed from a particularly unpleasant activity, well, maybe that's exactly what is maintaining the challenging behavior. So what are the consequences? We need to know that. And then following from that, of course, as Janice just described in some detail, is what is the communicative function? What is the motivation? What is the reason? What unconsciously is the child communicating? What kind of request is she expressing? What does she want? What does she want to result from this act that we have defined as challenging behavior? So those are the objectives. If we get good answers, confident, precise answers to these questions, boom, we've got a really good understanding, and that understanding is going to be very, very, very useful for us and for the child, importantly. So how do we go about this? What are the methods? Let me first of all say that there are many ways to conduct a functional behavioral assessment. Hundreds, maybe more than that. There are tools, there are instruments, there are surveys, there are questionnaires, there are experimental strategies. There are many, 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 and many of them are free on the internet. It's easy to download strategies and tools. And I'm going to add something else. Some of these, many of these, most of these are quite good. They really are. They could be very useful. But I also will emphasize that none are perfect. None will do everything. So it's important to understand that this is a process. It's your process. It's your process. You're the detective, and you're trying to get the answers to those questions we just posed. I can mention that Janice and I have developed strategies. We've developed functional behavioral assessment methods. And let me say quite candidly that they are really fun. They are excellent ways to go about functional behavioral assessment, but they're not perfect. They are not perfect. They're limited, just like every other method. Functional behavioral assessment has been a topic for about 40 years. So a lot of work has been done on this, and there's lots of strategies. But the big issue is to obtain the understanding we need and to do it in a way that is sufficiently precise, but also efficient. There's two main approaches that we use. One is observation, directly observing what's happening when challenge behavior occurs and what happens afterwards. There's a lot of tools for doing this. A lot of them form the ABC, or antecedent behavior consequence method, with a template that looks at what happens before, what is the behavior, and then what follows afterwards. And with enough observations, if you're looking at it in the right way, you can come up with patterns, and those patterns can be very, very revealing. So observation is a very, very key method, probably an essential method. But another way to do it is a complementary way, is to use interviews or questionnaires, basically to get information from those who know the child well and have seen the child's challenging behavior in relevant contexts. And then asking those people what comes before, what does the behavior look like, what comes afterwards, explain that in some detail. And again, you can get patterns, you can see what's happening. So interviews, observation, and questionnaires, usually both are the primary ways that we go about conducting a functional behavioral assessment. Let me add that there are also more technical strategies that are available. A common one that many people know about is called functional analysis. And that involves direct manipulations in a careful sequence in order to see when challenging behavior occurs more and occurs less. But that can be a little bit technical and is usually reserved for um, behavioral scientists or specialists who are doing that. And usually it's unnecessary. We can usually do a very adequate functional behavioral assessment without going into these more technical methods. When we collect a bunch of information, enough information, usually days, if it's really a persistent and real challenging example of challenging behavior, it might be weeks before we can really see adequate patterns to gain a sufficient understanding. But when we do, when we see these patterns, then we want to put them in a format that is somewhat useful, that's helpful for us. And the one that we recommend and that people have adopted universally is to develop what's called a hypothesis statement. A hypothesis statement is a brief statement that summarizes our understanding of the challenging behavior and how the challenging behavior is influenced by events in the environment. And what this means is we identify when or under what circumstances the behavior is likely to occur, why, what is the motivation or the reason that the challenging behavior is occurring. And we do this in what we call an ABC kind of format. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. When A happens, the behavior is likely to follow. And then, based on our observations and so on and so forth, a likely consequence occurs. How others respond, react, or function. And this is the simple format of a simple hypothesis statement. An example is going back to Hector. When it's time for morning meeting, that's the antecedent, Hector becomes disruptive. Climbing on the furniture, not responding, engaging in destructive play, and so on. And when he does that, the aide helps him find an activity in another part of the room. What we can conclude from this is that this morning meeting is something that Hector is seeking to avoid. That's the function. And unfortunately, the aide is actually inadvertently, probably because we know this aide is a very, very good person with great intentions. But the aide ends up inadvertently reinforcing it. So it's very, very likely in the future that when morning time comes around and Hector is not disposed to participating in morning meeting, he will become disruptive again and will be removed. Anyway, this is a simple hypothesis statement, but having this information helps us greatly to be able to design an intervention that will be effective and respectful as well as efficient. Here's another example, and this is going back to Jordan. Excuse me. Someone is playing with Jordan's favorite toy. That's the antecedent circumstance. Based on the patterns that we've observed in the process of functional behavioral assessment, Jordan will scream, yell, cry, scratch, maybe hit whoever is near. She may throw objects. And the typical consequence is that a teacher intervenes to help resolve the situation and provide comfort. Now, one might assume, based on this hypothesis statement, that Jordan's motivation for engaging in this challenging behavior is to acquire her toy. Well, the consequence doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be rather that a teacher is coming in and providing comfort for her. So perhaps we might interpret this as her disruptive behavior being rewarded by additional attention that the teacher is providing. But anyway, as you can see, this is a hypothesis statement that follows from the functional behavioral assessment and results in our being able to provide better intervention. So with that, I think it's time that we start thinking about the goodies. Like, what kind of implications does all this have for our being able to help kids? Understanding is not just a wasted endeavor. It leads to something important. And so I'm going to hand it off to Janice again to help us understand what that might be.
Thanks again, Glenn. Yeah, in terms of the goodies, I'm sure people are looking for, based on our previous experiences and a little bit of what I saw in the chat, right? They want, tell me what to do. What's next? So we're going to talk a little bit about implications first, again, to solidify our understanding of challenging behavior based on these perspectives. We hope that you already agree with these and are using these in your practice. But from what I saw in the chat, many of you are a type of coach or some type of behavior specialist or provide behavior support. So thinking about how do you take this information to help support the teachers and the classroom staff that you are supporting in this work, or it might be even families in that way. So when we think about what implications exist from a prevention standpoint, is that if we can predict when challenging behaviors occur, right? What are the specific circumstances that that Glenn discussed? So if we can predict those based on the information that we gathered and developed during that functional behavior assessment process, then ultimately we should be able to do something to prevent it. And so some of the things that we say very often is preventing these challenging behaviors, not by avoiding it from the adult perspective, but what are some strategies we can put into place in terms of instruction or changing around the environment. There are a variety of different strategies for that, which for today, unfortunately, we do not have time to address very specifically. And I know that many of you were here hoping to get those very specific answers. But in this moment, thinking about from a prevention standpoint, is being able to implement a strategy or two that can prevent that challenging behavior from occurring. And so again, to differentiate that from just avoiding the situation altogether, right? We're not going to just stop asking them to clean up or letting them just play outside whenever they want necessarily, but thinking about that. So a specific example for this, back to our example of Hector, is when he becomes disruptive during morning meeting, the teacher can include him as the meeting helper. And this is given the context that this is something that he enjoys doing. So we're not just going to randomly make him the morning meeting helper if we're not certain that this is something that he likes. And that way, by making him the helper, we can increase his engagement and participation and essentially prevent his challenging behavior from occurring. So we definitely want to differentiate that from just, well, maybe we're not going to ask him to come to morning meetings. So really thinking about all that information that's gathered through that functional behavior assessment process gives us enough information to be able to think about this in a very functional and purposeful way. So what are some skills that we can work on specifically for Hector to help him be more engaged during the morning meeting time? All right, so we hope that this somewhat simple example can start to help to put the pieces together in terms of implications from a prevention standpoint. And so even if we're talking about younger children, like middle or older toddlers, if we think about this same process, we can come up with some similar strategies for, from a prevention standpoint of preventing the challenging behavior. Okay, and if we move to the next slide. So that was just really briefly a quick overview, I guess, in terms of our implications for prevention. And then when we think about implications for intervention, okay, the prevention component was when those challenging behaviors occur. When we think about the intervention, or what are we going to do next, if we understand why the challenging behavior occurs, or again, back to the function, the communicative function of that challenging behavior, then in that sense, we should be able to identify what we can teach that child to do instead of the challenging behavior. So what can we replace that behavior with something that's more appropriate. And we can also subsequently too be able to identify different ways that we respond or that the adults respond to the child's behavior. So both to their appropriate behavior, but then also how we may change our responses to their challenging behavior. So again, back to the examples that Glenn shared also already, if we think about Jordan, who struggled when kids were playing with her toys, right? So she tantrums when somebody has that toy. So the teacher can embed multiple learning opportunities during the day for appropriately asking a peer for that toy. So again, instead of just avoiding it or telling that other child, like, this is Jordan's favorite toy, like, just let her have it, we really want to focus on teaching more appropriate and also acceptable social skills in this respect. So social and emotional skills, and thinking about what could be helpful for Jordan for the long term, right? We're always thinking about these long-term skills and strategies that can help her be not just successful in these environments, but really successful from a lifelong type of perspective. So that true, quality of life type of issue, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. So our context in early childhood, right? There's lots of implications in terms of moving forward. And this is just one small example of the way that that might look. Okay, and then we'll go to our next slide, our summary slide. And so just to summarize, again, this is a short webinar in that sense. We could spend lots more time on this, but we're hoping to provide this foundational perspective, and we do have hopes that we can continue this conversation. But a short summary for today, as Glenn started us off, is really defining and describing the child's challenging behavior. So what does that look like? We provided our broad overall definition of our perspective around challenging behavior, right? It impacts their ability to interact with others and to really be fully engaged in that social type of environment or context. And so when we see these persistent or consistent challenging behaviors occurring, we want to collect that data and gather that information, right? Possibly by using functional behavior assessment procedures, to understand when is the challenging behavior occurring and under what circumstances. The thing that I always like to say is that with young children, those are generally fairly easy to assess for and ascertain. But when we're talking about this process too, we're generally working with multiple people who might be part of this team, whether it's a family team or a teaching team. So we want to make sure that everybody fully understands as much as possible this true definition of our perspective of understanding challenging behavior from that sense. And then another component that we talked about today is that challenging behavior serves a purpose. So we do want to find out why is it happening and how are others responding to it. So again, related to that consequence component that Glenn was talking about. So again, thinking from that team perspective is ensuring that that challenging behavior is not that the child is being bad or malicious, that it's purposeful in that sense, but really thinking about that communicative function of that challenging behavior, how others are responding. And then the next component would then be, okay, then what are we going to do differently? How can we implement certain strategies to teach a new skill, for example? So that data, that information derived from the functional behavior assessment process helps the team come to that consensus around the function and really thinking about a succinct way to summarize it through a hypothesis statement. And so those are the things that we covered today. And then ultimately next steps, what we're hoping to be able to address sometime in the near future is how do you identify an appropriate behavior or skill to teach, or what processes might you go to do that? When are you going to teach those skills? How are you going to teach them? And then how are others going to respond differently to these new skills and behaviors? And then also how might they respond differently to the challenging behavior as well? So just a brief summary of our time today. We hope this helps you all in your work daily with young children and families and classroom level teaching teams. as well as from an administrative perspective too, I guess, so that global perspective in our early childhood environments and settings. So I think we will, I think we're going to be moving to
Okay,
questions.
Yeah, but first let me add just a little bit, and that is that, as Janice pointed out, we're hoping for the opportunity to expand and follow up on this webinar so that we can start embracing the entire approach to behavior support. And when we do that, we want to recognize that what we've shared today is just a slim little cutout of, how do we look at challenging behavior? But we're interested when we're talking about behavior support is the whole child, her preferences, his history, his family, his life, what makes this child tick and grow and love and have friends. And all of these go into the questions of behavior support, social emotional development, and so on and so forth. And what we've done is just focus in on how do we go about understanding this thing that we call challenging behavior. But it's only a tiny sliver of what the child is. It's a key one because we want to get past it, but it's just a little one that we want to put in appropriate context. So with that being said, I think it's time to move to questions, and I relinquish control.
That was great. Thank you so much. I know it was a bit, and of course you can imagine our questions are, but I have a kid and we have this, and what about this? And it's the foundation of a really complex, so I hope you're going to come back and build on this, because I think understanding this, and then we can understand what's next and really understand the process of behavior support. There are a couple of questions, though, I'm going to pose to you. They're a little bit hard, but I know you can handle them. And one of them is about children with disabilities. So one of our participants has a classroom. One kid she knows for sure has autism. A couple have been referred. And I think she's probably wondering, kind of, what do I do? And they have behaviors. Is this something that we do with children with developmental disabilities, in particular children with autism who are diagnosed because they have these kinds of behaviors?
You want to do that, Janice?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I guess the simple answer is yes. These procedures are applicable to any child or in any situation, really, or I guess I should say in most situations, because as Glenn indicated, it's not perfect in that sense. But definitely, I would know that the early years of researching research in this topic was specifically around individuals with developmental disabilities. And so some of the early work has evolved over time, and it's definitely applicable. Is it more challenging when you have multiple children with multiple individual needs in one environment? Definitely, yes. And so that really speaks to, using that prevention framework or a multi-tiered system of support like the pyramid model as a way to provide a context for that and have an organized way to teach skills that all young children need and how teachers might do that. And, given the challenges that we have in early childhood that we've had for years, but seem to be getting more exacerbated by the day, it feels like, I think we definitely respect and recognize the particular challenges that are existing in our environments. So part of this, understanding really is that perspective or the mindset around challenging behavior. What does that mean for that child? And from an adult or teaching perspective, then what can we do in that respect? So shifting from things like punishment or other exclusionary kinds of responses to really shifting to thinking about what skills can we really focus on teaching, and then how do we ensure that we do that's in a meaningful way for that particular child in that particular situation. So I know it's not a direct answer that everybody wants, but that is the reality for sure. So thanks.
Sure. So a participant has reflected that she has a child with really significant behavior. And from her perspective, it feels like it's all day, every day, and no discernible triggers. So Glenn or Janice, where should this participant start to try to make sense of this?
Wow. Well, I do understand where you're coming from. I think a number of us have encountered circumstances like this, and it's very tempting to throw up your hands and say, I give up, you know, that there's just nothing that can be done and so on. But I hasten to add that there is something that can be done. There's always something that can be done. And a first place to start, in my experience, is to look really closely and find times and circumstances under which challenging behavior is not occurring. I promise you that they do exist. And to find the circumstances associated with that. And then load them on. Yeah, give more of those circumstances. Sometimes there's a child who is just out of control and is just not following any kind of order. But it so happens that there's one speech therapist with whom that child is better, is okay, will sit and regard. I bring that speech therapist in for more time and more time so you can build on that. The point that I'm trying to make is that there's always an opening, and finding that opening and capitalizing on it is, in my experience, the best thing you can do. And from there, with more time with desirable social interactions and behaviors, you can extend it and build on more skills and more skills and more skills. But it's tricky, and I feel for you. I certainly have been there, and I don't like to be there. And I feel for that child, and I feel for the child's parents. But that's another place to look, of course, is home. Very often you'll see, wait a minute, there are times at home where Sheila is all right, and that's something to capitalize on. And so getting as much information from people who know and care for this child is also an important thing to do.
Right. I know, Glenn, that when you and I have worked together, when you first start, it's that messy place where you think, how will we ever figure this out? But I learned from you that you can figure it out when you approach it systematically and use this process. And once you figure it out, that really unlocks the key of how we design intervention. So it is a hard place to be.
I can add just a little bit to that, Lisa, because our experience together does go way back. That sometimes if you have these kids who everybody describes as just completely out of control and that there's nothing you can predict about it, often the best way to start is through what we call the antecedent environment. In other words, the function just seems so complicated and so ubiquitous that we're not going to get there. But if you start with the antecedent environment and find conditions that are associated with not just, acceptable behavior, behavior that you can work with and so on, then you get to the point where you can start figuring out, okay, what is the function of this behavior in this circumstance? And what's the function of this behavior in this other circumstance? And then grabbing hold of that, and then you can start really doing useful functional teaching and building on it. Anyway, we can go on and on with this discussion for weeks, but I don't think we have weeks. So
we don't. We have some really good questions, but we only have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one about teachers are really stressed, ratios are high in classrooms, is this something we think teachers just come to a webinar and learn and do, or how do we approach getting this understanding in support of early educators? I think you have 2 minutes now, 4 minutes.
Ready, go. It's such a big and complex question, Lisa, but I know that so many have them. And so, I think there is a big recognition right now of, what I mentioned already about the undue stress in so many variety of ways, like the different types of traumatic experiences that are happening all over the place. For a variety of reasons. And so when we think about where do we start, this type of information that we covered today about really understanding challenging behavior from that child's perspective, although it doesn't seem like it's helpful in the immediate, can be helpful in the classroom in terms of the adults' perspectives, or even when we're talking about families, the adults' perspectives about the challenging behavior. So if we, even frame it from a strength-based perspective in the sense of what does this child enjoy doing? When, again, what Glenn referred to is when are they not engaging in that challenging behavior? So when are those appropriate or acceptable behaviors occurring? And what is it about that? So even in a classroom setting, that building that relationship with that child, getting to know them really can go a long, long way. And so we do know that it takes time. We do know that it's, and we respect 100% that it's not necessarily easy, but that perspective from the adult, that attitude or that mindset really is the key for how do we move this forward. I don't think that we can emphasize that enough. But it's not always necessarily easy to address in that way either.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I think we're out of time, even though we have quite a few questions and quite a few people who are wondering about children with behavior challenges. So we didn't do a plug for your book, but you do have 2 great books that kind of package all this for early educators, either who are working with families or working with teaching teams. Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, and Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Families. So they're offered by Paul Brooks if you want to look at them. NCPMI has some great resources, but right now I just want to thank the 2 of you so much, and we're going to have you back because people want to learn more.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to both of our panelists for their wonderful insights. You should be seeing now a slide for the survey and certificate. Your feedback is very important to the work that we do. So please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and more. Thank you to our funder for making this webinar possible. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.